York.
Well, it's no secret New York's roads are in dire need of repair. Now, a new report by the Citizens Budget Commission says New York needs $5.7 billion to keep roads in good repair. The CBC looked at transportation statistics that show New York drivers, they drive on roads in rough or very rough conditions at double the rate of drivers from other states. They say New York has more structurally deficient bridges than the rest of the nation. And now the group is suggesting a new way for the state to raise money for roads. Joining me now is Andrew Rein. Andrew, the president of the Citizens Budget Commission, thank you for being here. I feel like maybe this isn't something that we weren't too shocked by. If you travel down the West Side Highway at all, you know that you're bound to fall in a pothole at some point or another.
And it's the same around the state, as you said, where our roads and bridges are in twice as worse shape as the national average.
So let's talk a little bit about vehicle miles traveled fee. What is that you're suggesting, and how would that impact everyone?
It is probably the future of transportation and transit funding. It is a way to charge drivers a fee for every mile that they drive on the road. It's a way, it's feasible, it can be fair, it can be sustainable, and correct some of the problems of our current funding system.
Are we seeing that done somewhere else? Give me an example of where this has been successful.
There have been pilots in California and Oregon. Oregon is in its second pilot, and it will become mandatory on new cars in 2026. And there are experiments and pilots on the East Coast as well. So it really is the future, but the future has to be planned for now, and that's why we're talking about it. Think about congestion pricing. It was a 12-year discussion before we finally enacted that. We need to get moving now so that we can have the next generation system.
I want to go back to congestion pricing, but before we get there, explain a little bit more about how this would be regulated. You mentioned something about new cars, so how are you tracking these miles?
There are different technologies, and that's part of what the experiments and the pilots are doing. But think about, for example, it could be a smartphone app or something like a transponder, like an Easy Pass, but probably in the future, and even currently in the pilots, an onboard unit that's basically a little computer that can track as little or as much information as you want, send it to a centralized system that could figure out how much you owe based on the policies of the state in charging for those vehicle miles. About
pricing, I know you're saying pilot, and I'm sure it would vary from place to place, but we're looking at congestion pricing and some people spending, $20 if you're in a truck and $15 if you're this. So what would this price look like? And do you believe that you should have this coupled with congestion pricing?
Well, for now, we should think about congestion pricing separate from vehicle miles traveled. We've enacted congestion pricing. It'll go into effect in 2 years. And yes, we don't know what the fee will be, so we'll see what that is set at in 2 years. But on vehicle miles traveled, it would be a much lower fee, just as the current motor vehicle fees, gas taxes are now. 1 to 2 cents a mile can generate a lot of what we need to in New York State, because right now we have $2.1 billion of underfunded maintenance on state roads. And that's just the 15,000 miles of state roads, not the 90,000 miles of local roads. So the charge would be low on a per mile basis, but could fill that gap.
And are you saying that this would go back to fixed roads? I know congestion pricing talks about mass transit. Where would you want this money to go?
Right now, what we've looked at is the underfunding in the roads and bridges and our cross-subsidization of transit around the state, not just in New York City. So this fee would be dedicated, and probably should be dedicated, to fixing those roads and bridges.
Do you feel like New Yorkers can sustain all of these taxes? Do you think it's an unnecessary burden?
It's very important to focus on spending control as well. We need to bring down the cost of maintaining our roads. We need to pick and choose which roads and bridges are most important to maintain. Still, there is an economic cost of having poor roads and bridges on cars and on truck traffic and on commercial vehicles. So I think an incremental amount would actually be helpful in the long run to keep those in a state of good repair.
We spoke to AAA about this. Robert Sinclair, I want to pull up, we have a full screen here with some text that he said to us. He says, we think VMT is something that could be explored, but it's a long way off. First, before we come up with a new tax, we should fix the funding for the state's dedicated highway and bridge trust fund. That's something similar that you just said. What would your response be to him?
I think he's right that we need to pilot and figure out the policies and the funding recommended, and we certainly shouldn't divert funds that are supposed to go for highways, and that's part of what the discussion is. But again, he's right. We have to look at these options, pilot them, and figure out how to fully fund our transportation system so that it can serve all New Yorkers.
And if you could have it your way, what would be the next step? How soon would something like this be implemented?
Well, it's hard to say exactly how long, but the next step would be to continue. There's an I-95 coalition on the East Coast that are exploring those, and New York State can be an active participant. Volunteers can sign up to pilot, and then New York State can start to be part of those pilots and decide what policies, what technologies it might choose, and begin that discussion now.
All right. Andrew, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.